We came here today because we want to see change. And not only do we want to seek change, we want to be the drivers of this change. We see the writing on the wall. We are drawn here because we want to change things. We are youth, but that doesn't mean that we're silent. We are youth, and it doesn't mean that we are not good enough. I'm sure we were all drawn here. We all boarded a plane or we boarded trains to come here because we wanted to not only be inspired, but to lead. And yet, many of us hesitate to be drivers of this change. Many of us, I find, tend to think that we are too young, that we don't want to be cringe, we don't want to fail, we don't want to try. Going to school in Japan, the United States, Germany, and the UK, I've seen all mixes of different cultures. I've seen people hesitate because they either didn't want to be cool enough, or they were told, you don't speak in class unless you know you are 100% right. Growing up in an Asian American family, I know the pressure to succeed when you're young. I know that you are often compared to people that are your age or younger, that your parents say, oh, they're better than you. Why can't you be like that? The reality is that you have to try. You have to move past this fear of failure, and you have to take risks. I'm a lot like you. I'm actually 22, and I just graduated college. I'm an incoming master's student at Sciences Po Paris and the University of Tokyo. And yet, even though I have that resume that was just discussed, even though I've worked with the United Nations, I oftentimes find that I don't always know what I want to do with my life. I still don't know how to do taxes. I was actually late the last time I filed. And I once told a boss of mine that I was born after 9/11. I saw an existential crisis wash over him, and he literally stumbled away from me because he didn't know what to do with a kid in his eyes. I don't think I'm that different from y'all. I went to bed at 1 a.m. today. I love reading Reddit. I'm on YouTube all the time. I still get things done. The only difference between me and you is that I found my calling earlier, and I want to use my voice to fulfill that. You don't need to be a certain age nor earn a certain amount of money to be a global change maker. I do not come from a family of billionaires. I do not come from a family of politicians or even artists. Yet I still did all of this from a family of complete STEM people, by the way, because I wanted to see change. People lead change in their own way. The key is discovering your own unique calling and finding ways you're individually key to fulfilling that calling. Now, what is my calling? My calling is disarmament, or the removal of weapons for a more peaceful, just world. How exactly did I come across this calling? I discovered this because of a mix of two things. One, finding the value in community as a young child, finding ways to appreciate that through volunteering. And then secondly, through a school shooting threat in the United States where I lived. So the volunteering part. My parents strongly believed in establishing community leaders in their family. And so as a child, I was often driven to shelters and also to food banks to volunteer. And starting from around 5 to 15, basically until COVID, it was a mix of anything from helping serve people food or helping cook food, or helping wash the dishes, or helping with inventory related to canned items and dried goods, for example. Through these experiences, I met a lot of different people in the community that I wouldn't otherwise necessarily meet as a school student at my very gentrified school. I met people who really put an impact in the community, people who had values different from the sort of things I was hearing from school. Especially in high school, I started hearing more about people who wanted to do internships, who dreamed of going to places like working in finance or something. And that's wonderful, that's great. But it was so different from the messages I was hearing from the community leaders at places like food banks, at the places I was volunteering. But that comes later. As a child, what I cared about was getting to know the other people in my community. And I genuinely thought, perhaps somewhat in a naive sort of way, that the community is the most important, and no one would ever try to destroy this incredible foundation in my hometown of West Lafayette, Indiana. When I was 11, my understanding of a school shooting was that, oh, this is something that happens at other schools. This is something that happens maybe in a city larger than my city. I don't have to worry about somebody shooting up my school. I don't have to worry about my classmates, who I've known since preschool, coming in with a gun. That all changed one day when I was 11. That day, my teacher received a phone call. We watched as her face paled, and she told me and my other classmates, "Get out of your desk, go to my desk," in the corner of the room. As children, we were very confused. We had never had a drill like this, and yet we all dutifully crawled under her desk. She walked to the end of the classroom, where she closed the door and locked it. Then she turned off the lights. She pulled down the blinds on a strip of window in the classroom door, and then she walked across the darkened room. She closed all of the windows, muting the sounds of birds calling, and then she turned down the blinds. And then she joined us under the desk. I didn't know what a school shooting drill looked like. I didn't know how to hide from a school shooter. I was 11, and I had never experienced anything like this before. When we did drills in school, it was drills for natural disaster things, such as a fire, or an earthquake, a tornado. She didn't explain to us what was happening. She simply told us, "Shh, don't talk." And so we looked at each other, and we didn't know what was going on. We thought, oh, maybe it's some sort of drill that we just don't know about. But over time, as the day changed, and our legs started to cramp, and we started to shift and talk a little bit, we realized that maybe this is something else. I was watching my teacher as we waited, and I realized she was listening, but for what? Or worse, for who? Eventually, a phone call pierced the tense silence, and she got up. She relaxed, and she told us, "You can get out now. You can return to your seats." We went back to our school desks, and then she turned on the lights. She opened the door. She opened the windows, and she told us what happened. There was a shooting at Purdue University, a 15-minute walk away from where I go to school. Perhaps in another situation, I would have thought, oh, at least I'm not hurt. Oh, at least it wasn't on my campus. It wasn't in my school. This news did not help. Why? Because not only me, but many of my classmates, many of the people that went to my school had parents who worked at that university. They had siblings who worked at that university. And what we knew was that there was a shooter, and at least one person was either fatally injured or already dead. We didn't know who, we didn't know where. We just knew at least one person was gone. And so we immediately started worrying. We were worried that it was our parents, it was our loved ones, it was perhaps a friend of ours. The rest of the day was just me in a daze. Me and my classmates, we kept talking and asking the same questions over and over. At 11, we don't have access to phones. We didn't know what was going on, and our teachers did not want us to panic. But in a way, because they starved us of information, we just spent the entire day tense and unhappy. Finally, we were let out of school. I ran to the parking lot where my mom, who was often chronically late, was waiting right there. I asked her, "Is my dad okay? Is he alive? Is he fine?" And she said, "Yes, he's fine. He's on the phone with me." She gave me the phone. I cradled it to my ear, and I asked him, "Are you okay? Are you hurt?" And he said, "No, I'm fine. Everything is fine." Over the next few days, I learned that my friends' parents were also fine as well. I would say that I was very lucky in this situation, along with many of those in my immediate community. But I often think about the worst case scenario. I often think about what if the school shooter had not stopped with one person? What if they had continued not only at Purdue University, but walked all the way to our middle school? Or what if they walked to my high school, well, what would eventually become my high school, which sat in the middle of the university and my middle school? It never left. And I think it also created this seed of doubt in me, this seed of doubt in established leaders. After all, I had to ask myself, how was this normal? How could this happen in a place of education? How are leaders letting this happen? And what exactly am I learning from this kind of leadership? There was another incident in my school that also made me question things. Thankfully, this one was not as dangerous, but I was once driven out to the countryside when I was in 8th grade to do a slave simulation. I was put on a bus and sent about an hour and a half away from where I went to school. We were sent to the middle of a cornfield with, I guess, a colonial reenactment of a village. And we met these historical actors who said that they were slave traders, or pretending to be slave traders. Now, in 8th grade, I didn't have much of a backbone, so when they asked, "Are you ready for the simulation?" I thought, sure, I guess, and I think I might have nodded. Me and my other classmates were deeply confused by this experience. The slave traders had guns on them, and one of them shot the gun in the air and then immediately started yelling at us. He and his, I guess, fellow actors immediately started screaming at us and insulting us and finding strange insecurities about us. They started verbally abusing us for the next 3 hours. Thankfully, it didn't, well, I don't know. I think it's thankfully, but they didn't ask us to do too many tasks. They ordered us to march around. They ordered us to line up. They separated us as breeders versus non-breeders, which I guess to them meant girls versus boys. Unfortunately, it was enough that some of my classmates broke down in tears. And eventually, we had to mime an underground railroad where we had to hide away from these slave traders. At the end, I went to the bus. It was already dark, and my teacher was there, my current issues teacher, and he said, "How was it? Wasn't it great?" I looked at the tears drying on my classmates' cheeks, and I thought, I don't think you looked out for us today. You're a teacher. You're supposed to care about us. You're supposed to care about our well-being and also how we learn. How did you think a slave simulation was a normal way to learn about social issues? How did you think this was a normal thing to do to the very people you were supposed to take care of? And so I began to wonder, do people in power have my best interests in mind as a young person, as a student? I'm raised in a family of scholars. I come from 5 generations of scholars, and if I'm lucky enough to be a professor, I will continue on my family's history. My dad loved school so much that when he did Hong Kong's, final exam, Hong Kong's version of the Gaokao, he placed second in the entirety of Hong Kong. I've always been told that school is a place of fostering learning. It's a place to find passion and meaning, and it's been exemplified in generations of my family. But between the school shooting, the slave simulation, and a few other incidents in my life, I really began to wonder, what is the placement of schooling? What does schooling mean? And also, do my teachers look after me? Do my elected officials care about these issues? If they think it's normal and justified, or perhaps they just simply don't care when school shootings occur. I personally felt that if people in power weren't going to stand up, then I needed to step up. I was not going to take this kind of behavior, this type of education, these kinds of policies lying down. I wasn't going to take somebody responding to a school shooting threat with thoughts and prayers. It felt ridiculous to accept that. Unfortunately, as I grew older, I found more incidences, more ways that violence seeped into the communities that I cared about. I learned how to get an illegal gun within my first week of college. I also learned that I come from a state that is often a trafficking state. Because of how easy the gun laws are in Indiana, it's incredibly easy buying a gun, legally even. And so many people buy large stacks of ammunition, large stacks of guns, and they traffic and drive them all the way to nearby Chicago, fueling the violence there as well as elsewhere in the country. I also found that, unfortunately, one of my classmates went to the University of Michigan, and there's a school shooter there. One day, I opened Instagram, and I found a story on her account saying, if you're at the University of Michigan, stay inside because there's a school shooter roaming the campus right now. I had another classmate of mine, this time when I was a university student. He drove 2 hours downstate to go to a mall with his girlfriend, to just have a cute little date and see family. I opened the Instagram story expecting to see my friend having a great time. Instead, I opened an Instagram story to people screaming in a mall. He was caught in a public shooting at the mall, a sudden event of just random violence where him, his girlfriend, and many other people were running and screaming because somebody decided to let off a gun. These incidences have always kind of echoed in my mind. And I felt, as I've said before, that I can't just take this. I can't just accept that this is normal, because it's not normal in much of the world. So in high school, I joined Students Demand Action Against Gun Violence in my city. I became the vice president, and we started holding monthly meetings discussing gun violence, discussing what we could possibly do on a legislative level in our state. And in a way, it also kind of became an almost trauma dumping place, a place where my classmates, other members of our community came together and talked not only of the school shooting at Purdue University, but also other school shootings that affected not only us personally, but family and friends in other parts of the country. Then I went on to advocate for other issues, such as mental health and battlefield preservation. Now, through these experiences, I'm not going to get into all of that. Through these experiences, I learned how youth have the power to advocate. In some ways, especially in Indiana, it often felt like a losing battle, but it still had meaning. It still gave not only me, but the other people in my communities, the other people who advocated with me, the sense that we did try something. While I was advocating for battlefield preservation, we were asked to also create a capstone project through an initiative I was part of. For the project, I started thinking, what can I do to contribute? I felt very run down and tired after trying to legislate, trying to advocate in the normal prescribed routes through which you're supposed to talk to elected representatives. And so I started thinking, what else can I do? And I knew that at school, I was already known somewhat for drawing pretty well and writing. I'd already won a few awards, so I figured, why not create a children's book? Seems easy, right? I decided that, you know what, we're gonna do our best. It might not be great. I met with a children's book author, and she said, you can't do this in 5 months. You can't do this. It's not doable. You're young. You don't know what you're doing. And I said, thank you for the advice. And then I started planning, because I've always believed that just because an established authority says you can't do this, you can't do that, because you're too young, you're too inexperienced, I don't think that's true. And it certainly wasn't in the case of writing this children's book. Over 3 months, I wrote and illustrated a children's book, Isabel and the Magic Bird, which eventually became an Amazon #1 new release. This book was published the day I graduated high school. When I went to college, I began to study political science. Why? Because I felt that the governance I'd experienced, the kind of policies that allowed an education that included things such as school shooting threats and a slave simulation, the fact that this was even okay or normal, I thought that was wrong. And so I began to study international governance. I began to study how other countries learned. While I was studying in college, I also was lucky enough to receive the title of Youth Poet Laureate. Under this title, it was really the first time I was asked to use my creative, artistic voice to advocate for local issues. I was given a mentor, I was given funding, I was given a position. I was asked to advocate for what I felt was relevant, not only to my hometown, but to my entire state. So then I ended up advocating for especially gun violence. I advocated for a more peaceful world with less guns, because why should that be something that people are scared of? Why is that a normal thing in the United States? While I was also honing my voice through the Youth Poet Laureate program, I was also invited to be on the board of directors for the Kurt Vonnegut Museum. Through that, I saw how the intergenerational power of the author Kurt Vonnegut, simply writing about things like nuclear issues, simply writing about a different future. He wrote these words like 50, 70 years ago, 50, 60 years ago in some cases. And yet I still met people in their 80s who told me about the first time they discovered his writing. And that's why they were giving us thousands of dollars. That's why they were part of this board. That's why they coordinated and helped us when we did things like book ban vans, when we talked about book bans and the threat against free speech in the United States. So I saw the power, the intergenerational influence of writing through that. Now, while I was developing my own artistic voice, I came to realize that I was deeply privileged and lucky to be able to have these experiences. And while this was happening, I met an Afghan poet I met her shortly before the US withdrew from Afghanistan, and I saw over a course of about 2 to 3 weeks how her life completely changed overnight. I saw how she went from being a normal high school student to suddenly being shut inside, forced to hide from the Taliban. She was suddenly no longer allowed to go outside unless she had a male relative with her at all times. She couldn't even go to school because she was a woman. I felt that this was horrible and deeply unfair, but there was only so much I could do in the United States. The best I figured that I could do at that time was learn about this issue better, learn about how the United States contributed to this issue along with other foreign powers in this sort of instability in Afghanistan. And randomly, through this class, we were given the opportunity to tutor Afghan refugees, as many of them were coming into a refugee camp in my state. After about a year of this, I decided that I could still do more. I felt that I could still contribute and that it wasn't right that it wasn't right that there were only so many people who could be positively affected by this. Now, in this section, I am not going to discuss specific cases. I am not going to show pictures of my students, the refugees, or the students I have in Afghanistan. Why? Because it is not safe to do so. It is not safe to mention their names right now. Some of them are still in the country, and I do not feel comfortable for their sake and privacy discussing specific instances like where they live, their names, and their circumstances. Now, for this part, I ended up thinking maybe I should create my own opportunity. Because yes, I could try to find another nonprofit, or I could go to the nonprofit that I already trust and suggest a new idea. So I went up to the nonprofit founder, the nonprofit that coordinated this tutoring, and I said, what if I created a semester-long advanced English and poetry course? I didn't know if it would do much, but I figured, I'm a Youth Poet Laureate. I have some experience using arts as a form of activism at this point. I had, I think, around 30 to 40 publications at that point, and I was around their age. I figured worst case scenario, they would get meaningful letters of recommendation from an American nonprofit, which at the time sometimes was the thing that helped them get into college, was sometimes the thing that would help them with a refugee application to the United States. And so the CEO actually really liked it, and he said, sure, go ahead. I didn't know what I was doing, so I ended up talking to a lot of different professors. I talked to educational professors and mentors and my own family about how do you teach? How do you work with a group of people? I ended up, over the course of a few months, creating a lesson plan for my students. I helped select the students, and then over the course of 6 months, we had a poetry course where we met up twice a week. It was a deeply wonderful experience, getting to know my students on a personal level. It was a safe space for them to talk about anything. They didn't have to talk about how they felt about the Taliban. They could just talk about, hi, this is my name and I love my family. This is my name and I love the winter in Afghanistan or wherever I lived. It did not have to be a situation where they had to talk about how they were suffering or whatever. It was a situation where they could just be kids. They could just be students. That's what I wanted. After the class ended, I ended up publishing a chapbook of their work, anonymously, of course, to protect their identities. And I also arranged 2 publication opportunities for them, 2 exhibits in the United States at Purdue University and the Kurt Vonnegut Museum. This not only helped them on a personal level, but helped them professionally, especially because some of them were applying to college. In the end, I wrote recommendation letters for all of my students, and I am still actually coordinating with some of them to get out of Afghanistan. Some of them managed to even get into college in the United States. I would say that all of this prepared me for what I'm probably more known for now, which is UN work in the nuclear disarmament space. But how did I get into this? I got into this because I actually was first deeply drawn to Japan's work around nuclear disarmament and the use of art in that situation. I was drawn to stories like Sadako Sasaki's and how she folded over 1,000 paper cranes so that she could, in the hopes that it would cure her leukemia, which she got after the bombings in Hiroshima and Japan. She did not survive. But the paper cranes are still being used today as a symbol of global peace and nuclear disarmament. When I went to Japan, I was struck by how people would fold these paper cranes, not only in Japanese classrooms, but in classrooms from around the world. They were told, you can send them to Japan and we will have them in these peace memorials. Memorials for Sadako Sasaki and other people, for all the children who died in the atomic bombings. I was also struck by the use of hibakuchumoku, or A-bomb trees, trees that have survived the bombings of Hiroshima or Nagasaki. When the bomb originally fell, there were quite a few people who genuinely believed that once an atomic bomb is dropped, that nothing would survive, no one would live, and nothing would grow, perhaps for years, decades, centuries, maybe even a millennia. Obviously, things survived, people survived, and hibakujumoku are one of those things. Hibakusha, survivors of the nuclear bomb, were the ones who took it upon themselves to take care of these trees and to ensure that the descendants of these trees, the seeds that fell from these trees, were not only sent to other parts of Japan, but to the rest of the world as a form of living memory. I was deeply struck by this, and I ended up I told multiple people about what I'd learned, and I ended up being invited by the Hiroshima Prefecture to attend an academy on nuclear weapons and global security. And there, once again, I was reminded and I learned that the education I received in America was a deeply biased experience. I did not learn about things like radioactive black rain. I did not learn about what happened on the ground when the bomb fell. When I spoke with hibakusha, many of whom were in their 80s and 90s, as they talked about their experiences being children and young teenagers when the bomb fell, I realized that what I had learned in America was a statistic. I was given numbers, how many buildings were destroyed, how many people killed, a death count, a statistic that does not even begin to capture the violence that this bomb left in this community, in this country. And so I returned to the United States afterwards, and I started noticing all the different ways that I had learned about this issue. I realized, actually, that my hometown, West Lafayette, Indiana, and the university, Purdue University, were actually involved heavily in the American military-industrial complex. I learned that Purdue University is one of several institutions that was part of the Manhattan Project, or the project that designed the nuclear bomb. This on top of the fact that some of my friends now were actually getting internships, and they were working at Lockheed Martin, they were working at Northrop, they were working at military contract companies. Why? For that salary. And I started thinking, maybe I shouldn't expand. Maybe I shouldn't just advocate for school shootings, well, against school shootings, and gun and conventional arms trafficking in the United States. So I started moving to nukes. I undertook a very quick pivot into researching nuclear education in the United States and Japan. I also began to perform poetry on nuclear issues. And I also exhibited work on post-bomb propaganda in the United States. I still felt like I wasn't doing enough. There was only so much I could learn while I was still in the cradle of a place that helped build the bomb. And so I moved. I left America, and I won't be coming back. I moved to Japan, where I became an exchange student at Waseda University, and I befriended nuclear activists from across Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Tokyo, and other parts of Japan. It was during this time that I began to be involved in the United Nations. As a youth delegate, I had the rare opportunity to be a civil society member, observing the second meeting of state parties for the TPNW. That's a massive mouthful. What does that mean exactly? The second meeting of state parties usually means that it's the second time a bunch of state parties decide to negotiate over a certain treaty. In this case, the treaty was the TPNW, or the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. This is a very fascinating treaty, one that really shows global majority leadership. It's a treaty where many countries have come together and decided collectively, we do not want nuclear weapons. We don't want them in the air, we don't want them in our waters, we don't want them on our land. How many countries? Dozens. The entire continent of Africa is a signatory of this. All the African countries have decided, we don't want this. Australia has also said, we don't want this. And Latin America and the Caribbean as well, among a few other countries like Mongolia. This, to me, was the first time I really saw leadership that reflected the values I cared about. I was deeply struck by what I heard from the state delegates of places like South Africa and Ireland, seeing how they advocated for a world that's more peaceful, a world that's more just. During this time, I began to pick my friends' brains about their experiences at military contract companies in the United States, and even my own family in the United States. I asked them, what exactly were you researching? What can you tell me beyond whatever you're not allowed to say with your secret security clearance? And I ended up writing a short story based off of what they said, because I started learning about a concept known as killer drones in, I guess, more colloquial speech. Killer drones are not a form of science fiction. They are a very real thing. They're being developed right now. And the question is not if or when these will be deployed. I could get into a bit more of a technical talk about all of this, but I was not asked to give a technical talk about things like killer drones or nuclear weapons. I was asked to technically inspire y'all with a leadership speech. I ended up writing a short story about reasonably what would warfare look like with AI military integration, or the use of AI in military technology. This story I ended up submitting this story for a UN contest, and I won an honorable mention, which, among other prizes, meant that I was sent to REAIM, a summit in South Korea last year where countries from around the world come together and figure out how exactly they want to legislate the use of AI in military technology. I also heard from leaders from Lockheed Martin and other forms of industry. Now, to be fair, there are some uses of AI that are positive, such as helping with identifying humanitarian people. On the other hand, the idea of, for example, removing human interaction or humans controlling a drone and coding a drone to kill people based off of, for example, something ridiculous like appearance or uniform is a deeply dangerous concept that, as somebody who had already done a few war games, I could immediately see immediate strategic problems with. I left that conference thinking, there is so much more to the field of disarmament than what I had originally thought when I first came in advocating against just having guns in the United States, or at least making it so that hopefully there would be less school shootings at places like my school. There is so much more to this topic. And it helped affirm to me that I wanted to study at an academic level the developing technology in warfare. Now, at the end of this conference, I began to work on my term as a UN Youth Champion for Disarmament. Now, under this term, I ended up having the opportunity to really talk about nuclear conventional weapons issues that I cared a lot about. I was able to advocate in the halls of the United Nations headquarters, meet mentors, and meet other youth leaders from around the world. I was able to discuss things and explain to other people, why can't the US just ban guns? Why can't the federal government just ban guns? I'm not going to get into the whole explanation, but basically, in short, it just doesn't work like that there. I was able to meet people who were advocating and researching a future without nuclear weapons, a future that has at least some safeguards around the possible use of AI in military drones and other technology. I was able to learn more about things like missiles and also what exactly was happening in our war spaces and also in spaces and also in urban warfare spaces. As a UN Youth Champion for Disarmament, we were asked at the end of our term to create a capstone project. And I thought about how exactly I was chosen for this and about the communities that had helped uplift me and also teach me about more than just guns. I thought back to Hibakusha, and I thought back to what they continually told me in Japan, in Hiroshima, and also when I was an exchange student at Waseda University. They told me, we want an apology from the US. We want acknowledgement that this happened. We want to be recognized by the Japanese government. We deserve to have not only legal compensation, but also medical compensation. Our families, our friends, us, in some cases, we have been lost. We have died early. We have experienced severe medical issues on top of deep psychological pain, watching classmates and friends die in front of us. I do not have a direct line to the United States government. I do not have a direct line to the president. But I do have a direct line to the UN. And so I started thinking, what can I reasonably do in this position of responsibility that can help give back to the community that put me in this space in the first place? And so I started thinking about hibakujumoku, or the trees that have survived the bombing of Hiroshima or Nagasaki. And I started thinking, what if I could get this planted at the United Nations headquarters in New York? It would be a deeply symbolic experience, but also one that really affirmed to the hibakusha community and other nuclear disarmament communities that the United Nations cared about this issue, that the United Nations supported them. And so I went to my mentors and I suggested this project, and enough emphasis discussing what the sort of responsibility that scientists have when they design technology that they perhaps think will only be used in the short term. I thought, maybe, what if we put a hibakujumoku, in Purdue University? What if we coordinated classes in scientific ethics around things like this? If people led classes there and asked students to think about the meaning of their work, the impact of research for things such as the nuclear bomb in the long run. And I ended up emailing an herbarium in my university, and I genuinely thought they would say no, but they actually really liked the idea. And we ended up we are still in the process of coordinating a transfer of the trees to there. I also was coordinated with UNLYRIC, the UN body in Latin America and the Caribbean. And through several state meeting parties, they decided that they would also like a tree in Mexico City. Now, out of all of these tree projects, the only one that has appeared so far is the one at the United Nations headquarters. Okay, as you can see, these are the two trees. These are persimmon trees. They were fostered in, I believe, San Diego's botanical garden and then sent as saplings to New York. I was given a lot of updates about the progress of these trees as they were being sent over, and I was very happy to hear that even before they were planted, they were already a sort of community symbol within the United Nations. There had to be people who fought to have these trees planted in the first place. There's a lot of red tape around introducing new things like trees to the United Nations, bringing in suspiciously large packages to their mailrooms. My mentors helped fight to get these out of the mailroom before they died, and other people at UNODA, the United Nations Office of Disarmament Affairs, they helped water these plants for weeks as we tried to figure out a time to get these planted. Trees are obviously very delicate things. You can't just plant them anytime you feel like it. You have to plant them in a climate and a time where the tree can feasibly survive beyond just a few months. And so we waited until May, and I was told we would have it on a slightly cloudy but moist and cool day for the trees. I showed up in the United Nations, and I genuinely thought it would just be me and maybe 3 other people there. I thought it would be maybe me, my mentors, and maybe 2 people from the UN Gardening Club who promised to be the organization that in the United Nations that took care of this tree for the rest of the tree's life, which is anywhere from, if we're lucky, 60 to 80 years. I showed up and I found out that a lot of people wanted to see this tree. Behind me is the UN General Assembly president at the time, President Yeung, the Japan's permanent representative to the United Nations, and Itsumi Nakamitsu, the Undersecretary of Disarmament Affairs, and I suppose a fellow Waseda alum. And not only them showed up, other people in civil society, people in various organizations such as ICANN, one of the Nobel Prize-winning disarmament organizations showed up. Members of civil society who were curious about this issue were invited, and we were able to have an entire ceremony. During the ceremony, I was asked to create a haiku. As you can see here, it was also published on the United Nations website. The haiku is called Germinate. Here lies shattered dreams among warped tree glass and boiled tiles, yet here a tree grows. I was inspired by conversations and visits I had to descendants of hibakusha and disarmament advocates in particularly Nagasaki. There's a museum there that actually actually shows you the clay tiles in Nagasaki. And it shows one side before the bombing, or like a side that was not touched by the searing of the bomb, and another that shows how how clay literally boiled because of how hot the bomb was. Now, doing these sorts of things, advocating for disarmament, for a world without not only nuclear weapons, but also without guns, is a very difficult task. There's a lot of people, especially in private industry and military contracting companies, who don't believe in these sorts of things. Choosing to also advocate through something like poetry and art also makes some people skeptical. Why poetry? Why art? And as somebody who is in many spaces, I am not only just in disarmament and civil society spaces, but also academic spaces, spaces dominated by American policy hawks who believe in things like the United States should have all nuclear weapons, things like that. And I also often sometimes ask myself, am I the right person to do this? Am I qualified enough? After all, I'm speaking here as a 22-year-old. I did a lot of these projects when I was anything from 14 to now, at this age. And my responses to these are, I feel like, pretty simple. The first is that words have power. We all know of speeches and writing that directly impacted us, that changed our societies, anything from Confucius to other texts. There are so many texts that are seminal to our cultures, to our understanding and our collective philosophies as societies. You can't just say words don't have power. The other thing is deferring values. I have personally found, as somebody who grew up in a place that had values very different from mine, that if somebody is mature enough, then we can put aside our political differences and work towards common goals. We may disagree on a few things, but as long as we agree on the core goal we have, which is enriching the community in some way, then that's all I care about at that point. There is often this tendency, especially in the United States, to refuse to talk with people that have a different political leaning from you, that have a different background from you. And perhaps if you grow up in a place with people exactly like you, that is a doable thing. But once you start working beyond just your highly localized friend group or university, if you start working on a national level and international level, you might begin to encounter people with different opinions. And the reality is, you're just going to have to put aside those differences and find a way to work together. And finally, some people ask, am I qualified enough? And I ask myself that sometimes. My thinking is that at this point in time, I come from many different experiences, lived experience as somebody who has been affected by gun violence, as well as academic experience, publishing academic articles, creative writing articles, publishing work on this issue in many different forms, advocating for it as a poet, as a civil society member, things like that. But I think the more relevant message for y'all is that organizations know that you're young. Organizations know that we are literally in school right now. They don't expect us to have a decade of experience. But what you can do is advocate for yourself. What you do is you explain how the skills that you've learned in school and other places can be translated to work that helps further an organization's goals. As long as you can communicate that more often than not, it gives you at least a fighting chance when you're applying to things. And finally, no criticism holds even a candle to a time when my students, for example, message me on Teachers' Day in Afghanistan and tell me that they miss my class, that they would love to talk with me sometime. It doesn't hold a candle to when my former students message me with new writing. It doesn't hold a candle to what I'm doing right now, which is returning to teaching Afghan youth. It doesn't hold a candle to planting seeds of hope and wonder for current and future generations. Now, to conclude, I want y'all to remember three things. I want y'all to remember that people lead change in their own way. There is no need to be a certain age nor earn lots of money to be a global change maker. And you and I are no different. At the end of the day, the world is not going to wait for us. There are so many social issues, so many things that must be worked on. I hope that we are not a generation that is seen as poor. I hope we are not a generation that is seen as greedy, or the kind of generation that put our personal enrichment and wealth and our own personal gain ahead of future generations. I want us to be remembered for being change makers. I want us to be remembered for being better, for wanting a world that is not only more free and just for us as individuals and in our immediate communities, but for the global community, for the entire world. I want to not be the only person on this stage. I want y'all to be up here as well. I want to see a crowd of global change makers. So find that calling, because we can't wait for a billionaire or the United Nations or some other organization or individual to do the work for us, to advocate for us. We need to step up now. So find that calling, take that first step. The world needs you. Thank you.